This video is sponsored by Private Internet Access. Check it out via the link in the description. Hello, loyal followers of Hong Shi Quan, also known as the Brother of Christ. Today, we're going to learn about the adventures of the globe-trotting mercenary Frederick Townsend Ward and his ever-victorious army. Find out why it's bad for the economy when your two largest trade partners devolve into civil war. And hear the tale of China's first modern flotilla, the Vampire Fleet, and how it nearly defected to the Taiping Christian rebels and then to the Confederate States of America. Just know that this video is a companion to our two-part series on the Taiping Rebellion, which you can check out by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. While this video totally works on its own, knowing the history of the Taiping Rebellion will add useful context. Anyway, you can call me Ezekiel. And these are tales from the Taiping Rebellion. If I could describe Frederick Townsend Ward in a sentence, it would have to be a real-life Mountain Blade protagonist adventuring in Taiping-era China. You see, in the middle of the 19th century, armies of adventurers gathered to overthrow small national governments and replace them with their own private states. These armies were called filibusters. Most operated in Central America, but one man had the idea to bring the concept to China. In 1831, Frederick Townsend Ward was born the rebellious son of a New England sea captain in 1831. After spending several years serving aboard various ships, he would study at the Norwich Military Academy but leave after only a year. He then had various adventures around the world, serving in the Central American filibusters in 1852 and then as a French officer in the Crimean War. But our story begins in 1860 when he arrives in China. Ward came to China intending to found his own filibuster and sell its services to the Taiping rebels, but he was unable to make contact with them, so instead decided to hire himself off to Shanghai's wealthy merchant community. But since Shanghai was a Qing-controlled city, this meant he was technically fighting for the Qing, his original intended enemy, and against the Taipings, his original intended employer. Ward's first task was to guard the merchants' trade ships from pirates and rebels, but considerably expanded his role in 1860 after recruiting his own private army of 200 Americans, Europeans, and Filipinos. His new mission was to defend the city of Shanghai itself and his wealthy merchant patrons inside from the approaching Taiping rebels. In doing so, he had created the first Chinese filibuster. Ward's force first saw combat in April in a botched attempt to take the city of Songjiang near Shanghai. But after growing his force to 500 men and purchasing 2 cannons, he was able to take Songjiang in June, turning the city into his headquarters. Ward continued to lead his force against the Taipings until May of 1861, when the British arrested him while recruiting in Shanghai. This arrest was part of a wider British policy to maintain their neutrality in the Civil War by stopping foreigners from fighting in it. But Ward was an American, so only the American consul had the power to prosecute him. Ward threw a wrench in that plan when he revealed that he was no longer an American citizen, but a subject of the Qing Empire. He was even due to marry a Chinese woman. All of this had been arranged at the last second, with the help of the Shanghai merchants. So with Ward outside of American jurisdiction, the consul was unable to prosecute him. The British still didn't want to let him go though, so they tried keeping him prisoner aboard a ship. But one night, Ward was able to escape through a window and resume his adventures. One of those adventures involved the American Civil War. A rumor had gone around that Ward had been given a letter of marque from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and that he had purchased a ship which he planned to arm and use to disrupt Union shipping in China. The Civil War had forced the Union to recall all but one of their warships from the region. But when the Union's only remaining vessel in China, the USS Saginaw, investigated Ward's boat, they didn't find any guns aboard, only whiskey. While the incident itself came to nothing, the episode made Ward famous in the United States. In one article, the New York Times described him as, quote, the celebrated filibuster. Now, Ward's story isn't over yet. If anything, it's just getting started. Because he's about to reform his filibuster into a totally new and improved force, the ever-victorious army. A key part of any armed force is operational security. Obviously, that's something Ward's early forces struggled with, but with the help of today's sponsor, you won't have to. Right now, governments, hackers, and internet service providers can see everything you're doing. They're collecting and recording all of it to sell for profit and to track your beliefs. You need the best tech to protect you and your privacy, and that's exactly what today's sponsor can help you with: private internet access. Private internet access is the world's most transparent virtual private network, or VPN. A VPN protects and anonymizes all of your online activity and has extra benefits. I use a VPN on every one of my devices, and you should too. Private internet access is one of the best. It's been proven multiple times in court and by third-party audit that they never record your data. In addition to keeping you anonymous and safe online, you can also use private internet access to change your region, allowing you to circumvent region locks and view content otherwise exclusive in other regions. This includes all of your favorite streaming services, allowing you to access Netflix content from other countries at will. And, rare among VPNs, private internet access supports peer-to-peer file sharing. I never go online without a VPN, and neither should you. You can use private internet access on an unlimited amount of devices of any format, including Windows, Mac, Android, Linux, and iOS. So use our exclusive link in the description to get up to an 83% discount and 4 extra months for free. With 24/7 support and a 30-day money-back guarantee, signing up is totally risk-free, and a great way to thank private internet access for sponsoring our content. And now, back to the video. By the time of the Second Shanghai Offensive in 1862, Ward had totally reformed his army. Instead of restricting himself to foreigners, he focused on recruiting native Chinese, with foreigners being used as instructors and officers. At the suggestion of his patrons, Ward also renamed his force to the Ever-Victorious Army, which appealed to Chinese sensibilities way more than its previous name of Foreign Arms Corps. The word foreign being particularly distasteful to the xenophobic Chinese. The ever-victorious army was equipped with all of the most advanced weapons the Shanghai merchants could buy them, including cutting-edge Enfield rifles and whole artillery batteries. They even almost got their hands on a few gunboats. The ever-victorious army would eventually grow so large that Ward promoted himself to general, and inspired a French filibuster based on his model. When the Second Taiping Offensive arrived, Ward's army proved so effective that it almost single-handedly stopped their advance. Pro-intervention American and British officials in China noticed this. They started to consider using Ward's force as the nucleus for an even larger foreign-led Chinese-manned army to assist the Qing. Limited cooperation between Ward and foreign-led troops began in February, and got into full swing when the Allies openly intervened in the spring. Together, they made significant progress pushing the Taipings away from Shanghai. In May of 1862, Ward married the daughter of Yang Fang, a wealthy banker and one of his most important patrons. It was a good arrangement for both sides. Yang wanted better control over Ward, and needed to get rid of his daughter whose betrothed husband had died, making her damaged goods in the eyes of Chinese society. Ward, meanwhile, secured Yang as a rich and powerful patron. Ward would continue to lead the ever-victorious army until September 21st, when, on that day, he was shot in the stomach and killed. Ward's successor would be the North Carolinian Henry Burgoyne, who led the ever-victorious army well enough until he clashed with Yang over strategy and back pay. This came to a head when Burgoyne and his men assaulted the banker in his home and robbed him of 40,000 taels of silver. Burgoyne was promptly fired, and had a bounty put on his head, so naturally, he ran off to join the Taiping rebels. All of this left the ever-victorious army without a leader. It's here where Frederick Bruce, of Second Opium War fame, re-enters our story. Always down to exert more British influence in China, Bruce placed English officers in charge of the ever-victorious army. He first tried the British Captain Holland, who immediately led them into disaster, so replaced him with an officer from the Royal Engineers, Charles Gordon. While he did a much better job than Holland, Gordon enforced strict discipline over the army, which caused it to shrink until it had to be disbanded in May of 1864. Gordon, however, would go on to become one of the greatest and most famous adventurers of the Victorian era, his time fighting in China earning him the nickname Chinese Gordon. So leave a military medal emoji in the comments to commemorate Frederick Ward, Chinese Gordon, and the men of the ever-victorious army. In 1861, as Taiping's and Qing loyalists fought for the Mandate of Heaven, a nation on the other side of the Pacific, the United States, devolved into its own civil war. While the Americans and Chinese were obviously the biggest losers from this, the next biggest losers were the British. You see, China and America were Britain's most important trade partners. 75% of Britain's raw cotton was imported from America, manufactured into finished goods, and was supposed to be exported to China for final sale. But the Union blockade of the South meant that Britain lost much of its cotton supply, and the few textiles they could still make would find few buyers in a China ravaged by civil war. By 1862, things got so bad that in the cotton-reliant city of Lancashire, unemployment rose to 60%, a depression known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine. These civil wars didn't just create an economic crisis for the United Kingdom, but a diplomatic crisis too. British lawmakers had to decide whether to extend belligerent status to the rebels in each conflict. This status was not only a key step on the path to full recognition, but also allowed British firms to extend loans and sell weapons to the recognized power. The British had many reasons to support the Confederacy in America, so were quick to recognize them, but the Taiping situation was more complicated. British officials in China generally agreed that it would be favorable to the Qing to remain in control of the country. Like the Ottomans in Europe, the Qing were a decadent dynasty, unlikely to ever pose a serious threat to anyone. The Taipings, however, were young and full of vitality. There was no telling what kind of trouble they could cause. The British also had a vested interest in supporting the Qing government, thanks to the massive reparations it owed them. Opposed to them were Britain's missionary community, who wanted to support the Christian rebels, merchants who saw the Taipings as likely trade partners, and many politicians, who pointed out that the Qing had committed many atrocities against the British, while the Taipings had only ever been friendly to them. After much political wrangling, the Taiping supporters were eventually convinced to settle for withholding belligerent status, on the grounds that it would keep Britain out of the conflict. But they had been duped, because it left the Qing as the only recognized government in China, giving them the exclusive right to legally purchase British weapons and take on British loans. In effect, the Taiping supporters had effectively allowed Britain's lot to be thrown in with the Qing. This support would eventually culminate in a direct intervention in the conflict, as well as in a strange episode known as the Vampire Fleet. In our main series on the Taiping Rebellion, we covered Hong Rengan's modernization plans in some detail, but mostly brushed over what Zhang Gaofan wanted for China. Zhang was not nearly as enthusiastic about adopting Western institutions as Hong was, nor did he like the idea of allowing foreigners into the country, but he was very interested in Western technology. One of the main reasons is that ever since the First Opium War, most Chinese believed that Western troops were invincible. In Zhang Gaofan's opinion, Chinese fear and superior weapons were the only real advantage the Europeans had over China, so he thought that if the Chinese could get their hands on the foreign weapons, they would not only reap the material advantages, but also give the average Chinese soldier enough confidence to get over his fear of the Westerners. Zhang's first move was to purchase a small steamship in Shanghai and had his men reverse engineer it. The prototype they created was successfully attached to a working paddle propulsion system. But that was a far cry from a real fleet of gunboats, and there was no way he could create one in time to win the Civil War. So instead, he reached out to the foreigners. Through Frederick Bruce, the Qing's Prince Gong, uncle of the reigning child emperor, was able to get in touch with British firms who agreed to sell him a gunboat flotilla. The only catch was that gunboats were one of the few weapons prescribed even to recognize belligerents. So in August of 1862, the British government passed a law making it legal to sell gunboats to the Qing government. And because there were few Chinese who could crew a modern fleet, Parliament also made it legal for British officers to serve in the Qing military. Thanks to the influence of British officials, Zhang Guofan and Prince Gong were able to accomplish what the Taipings had only dreamt of. They put a modern gunboat flotilla in Chinese hands. Or at least that's how it seemed. The British would build one of the most advanced fleets in the world for China, and place it under the command of their very own Captain Sherard Osborne. By the time the fleet left for China, the flotilla had gained an interesting name for itself: the Vampire Fleet. The Vampire Fleet was in for a very nasty surprise when it arrived in China. Instead of going directly into the action, the fleet was kept in Shanghai's port while Zhang Guofan and Prince Gong fought for control of it. In a show of Zhang's immense power and influence, he beat out the emperor's uncle. He then chose to demote Captain Osborne to assistant commander, under an admiral loyal to himself. From Osborne's perspective, he had just been demoted from being answerable only to the Qing emperor to the subordinate of a provincial governor he had probably never heard of before. Osborne traveled to the capital to protest. And while that was going on, the fleet's crew became restless. Many started to abandon it to join the Taiping rebels, forcing the entire flotilla to relocate out of Shanghai. The situation got even more chaotic when Osborne resigned to protest his demotion, but without handing the fleet over to Zhang or the Qing, leaving the men of the fleet free to decide their own fate. The Vampire Fleet considered its options. They ranged from abandoning the Qing and joining the rebels, to leaving Asia, circumnavigating South America, smashing through the Union blockade, and fighting for the Confederate States of America. And, listen, I don't care what you think of the Confederacy. That objectively would have been awesome. We could have had a combination of Xenophon's March of the 10,000 and the Odyssey across the 19th century Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. But if you know anything about history, you'll know that didn't happen. Instead, the American minister to China, Anson Burlingame, got wind of what was happening. So he rushed to the fleet and said, "Wow guys, what a neat idea, but how about you do literally anything else?" He was then able to get the British to agree to dissolve the fleet, so its fate would be to get sold at a loss and return to India and England. So ends the almost kick-ass tale of the Vampire Fleet. The other major initiative Zhang Guofan undertook was sending Chinese agents to foreign countries to acquire advanced technology. This initiative would prove much more successful than the Vampire Fleet. Unlike the Taiping's Han Rangan, who was happy to work with foreigners, Zhang considered them to be ungentlemanly and immoral. He only trusted fellow Chinese, particularly those who already had experience living in foreign countries. One of his best agents was Young Wing, a graduate from the United States' Yale University. You know, back when that was actually impressive. After Zhang and Yang got to know one another at the Hunan Army's headquarters in Anqing, Zhang asked Yang if there was anything he could do to help the Qing war effort. Yang offered to return to the United States so he could ship back machinery and weapons. Zhang approved. Young Wing arrived in the United States in 1864, right in the middle of its Civil War. In spite of the ongoing conflict, he was able to purchase an entire factory's worth of steam-powered machinery and ship it back to China. With his mission accomplished, he chose to stay in America to attend his 10th Yale reunion. There, he was inspired to enlist in the Union Army and help put down America's rebellion too. One of the most interesting features of Han Rangan's memorandum to the Heavenly King was its review of the nations of the world. Each one reads almost like a race or class profile you'd see in a tabletop role-playing game. By the way, did you know that this channel has its own official historical tabletop role-playing game? It's called Iron and Blood, and it supports adventures anywhere in the real or alternate history world between 1500 and 1875. That includes Taiping-era China. You can find the game and a link to its official Discord in the description, which is the #1 place to find and host games of Iron and Blood. And before you ask, no, there are no race profiles in Iron and Blood. Anyway, it's always fun to learn about how different nations and cultures view each other, so let's enjoy Hong Rengan's assessments together. According to him, Great Britain was the most powerful nation in the world, thanks to its enduring institutions and ruling family. The British people were proud and intelligent, and responded well to language communicating equality, friendship, harmony, and affection. The Americans were a righteous people, who neither encroached on the borders of others, nor hoarded wealth for themselves. The Americans did not bar foreigners from exploiting discoveries of gold and silver in their country, instead choosing to welcome them in and share in the spoils. America was ruled by so-called chiefs of the country, who were selected by the component states by putting the names of candidates into large boxes. Each chief served a 5-year term before retiring to live in comfort. The American people trusted this system to provide them with worthy and capable rulers. They also believed that decisions reached by majority were always just. The Germans were primitive, resembling the peoples of ancient times, but were devout and conscientious nonetheless. The Scandinavians were of severe countenance, had fair hair, and were both broad-minded and friendly. France was the source of all the arts and technology used by the Western powers, but was too steeped in mystical tradition to be truly praiseworthy. The French were Catholic, and the Taipings were technically Protestant. The Russians ruled a large nation in the midst of major reforms. Reforms which would, no doubt, soon make Russia into a major force. And finally, the Japanese, as a nation, had only recently been open to trade with the Americans, but were steadily acquiring new techniques from them and, quote, will certainly become skillful in the future. And those are my tales from the Taiping Rebellion. We learned about Frederick Ward and his ever-victorious army, the United Kingdom's dangerous over-reliance on Civil War-prone trade partners, the vampire fleet and how it nearly did one of the coolest things in history, the story of young Wang, and finally, what Hong Rengan and the Taipings thought about all the foreign powers. This video was funded by veterans of the ever-victorious army, with fortunes made from their campaigns in China, including G.S. Rogers, Josiah, Pater, the Raven Union, the Union of X, and Viceroy Ethan Albert. And by this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Use our exclusive link in the description to get up to an 83% discount, and 4 extra months for free. Doing so is a great way to thank Private Internet Access for supporting this channel. Links to them and where you can support us directly are in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.